Well, good morning. This video is actually being recorded in September. Actually, my birthday weekend in September, interestingly enough. But I'm not releasing it until December. In fact, I'm planning on releasing this video on Christmas Eve. You might be wondering why I'm making a video in September that I'm not going to release until December. But hopefully, as I get further into the details of what today's episode is about, it will all make sense. Today, we're going to talk about the birth of Jesus. Now, going back to some of my other series, notably my one on the Bible, I had brought up this particular book that I wrote many years ago. And this was a deconstructive analysis of some of the problems that we find in various scriptural interpretations, okay? One of the key questions that I address in this actually is around the information regarding the birth of Jesus. And I explained what those conflicts and problems were in detail in this book. And these are ideas that come directly from the leading scholars in the field. However, what I want to address today is actually the appropriate and correct response to many of these criticisms, and how new information about the time, the day, and the place of Jesus of Nazareth's birth actually has allowed these questions to not only be answered, but to fulfill other prophetic traditions that we're probably not even aware of or weren't aware of. But before I get ahead of myself, we need to step back. Because in order to make sense of any of this, we have to put it in the context of when these events are happening. First century Rome. So, let's start there, and then we'll move forward. This is going to be a fun journey, so stick with me. I have no idea how long this video is going to end up being, but we're going to try to hit all the main points. I'll also share with you some reputable secondary sources in case you want to do some research on your own. Obviously, I can't cover all the material, but I'm going to try to hit the main ideas, and I think that'll be enough. One of the ideas that we find within the classical tradition throughout all types of cultures, right, is there is a emphasis on what is known as astrological divination, okay? It's an actual type of ideological belief system that assigns value to astrological movement of stars, and then in turn operates under the assumption that through the interpretation of those movements, certain conclusions can be made, okay? Divination, by the way, just as a just sort of a caveat, essentially means acquiring knowledge through some other thing, right? And it's usually some type of hidden or secret knowledge, like we find in the occult. But it comes through looking into something, and that could be anything from the divination of spirits, where they provide you with information, like the story we find in the book of Samuel, right? When Saul conjures up the spirit of Samuel with the witch of Endor, which we talked about in one of my other videos. But also, it was very common in this world to look to the stars for this sort of divination of astrology. Okay, so it's astrological divination. Now, this was true of pretty much all ancient cultures. So we're going to be looking at the Mediterranean traditions. Of course, we're going to look at the Greco-Roman tradition because that's the space that we're in. But you can find these traditions across the globe, okay? In contrast, what we're going to find specifically in the book of Revelation, in the New Testament, but which is truthfully an overarching idea throughout all of the Christian narrative, is what's called eschatological revelation, okay? An eschatological revelation is actually the exact opposite to astrological divination. In fact, it's in some sense a response to astrological divination. In my previous series on the Bible, I highlighted how the story of Jesus of Nazareth, his birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection, was really a reversal of the 3 falls we encounter in the scripture. So he's turning things back. There's more to it than just that, but it has to get into a lot of nitty-gritty details. And that's what I want to talk about today. And that's why I saved a lot of this information for today, because I thought it would be an appropriate video for Christmas, because that's the season we're going to be in, and that's really what this is all about. So let's start with this question of how is eschatological revelation a response to astrological divination, okay? Well, if you grew up in a church or, whatever, went to Christian schools or anything like that, you'll know that eschatology is this idea of a movement, right? There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, okay? Creation, and we as part of that creation, are moving towards something, right? This is this sort of eschatological movement, okay? And a revelation means the unveiling or the opening up. It's sort of like pulling back the curtain, okay? And within this idea is the idea that God will reveal certain things to humans about himself, okay, and his plan, okay, and his goals for his creation, okay? This does not mean that the people who obtain that revelation gain power over and against others, right? In fact, the opposite is true. The revelations of God empower all, okay? Now, in the case of astrological divination, it's the opposite. Okay, astrological divination, first of all, doesn't believe in eschatological movements, okay? It doesn't necessarily believe in a beginning, a middle, and an end, as if the creational order is moving towards something. Rather, it follows the zodiac, which is a perpetual circle, right? The seasons of the year. If you think of the zodiac representational of the various months of the year, and as the world turns and as the stars change, they go back on a pattern, and there's just this sort of cycle, and it's sort of this perpetual idea that it's always sort of going around, and there's never really a beginning, and there's never really a middle, and there's never really an end. This is the nature of a wheel, right? There's no starting point. It's for reasons like this that we find ideas like reincarnation very prevalent in other cultures, where this idea is that it just keeps going. There really is no end. It's just a perpetual cycle, okay? But the idea is that you can obtain certain information through divination, right, by studying these stars. Now, one of the problems that we find with any astrological worldview, okay, astrological ideology, is there is this conflict that exists socially and culturally and intellectually between fate and freedom, okay? And the idea is that if everything is essentially determined by astrological bodies, right, in the way that they rotate and spin and move, and that dictates, the coming of the seasons and the various events of the year, including wars and the rising of kings and the falling of empires, but also even just day-to-day life, that is deterministic because it's already established in the creational order of the stars themselves that don't change, right? They're measurable and they follow a set pattern, okay? So the problem with that is, well, then in that model, where is there room for free will, right? It's a deterministic model because it's based on deterministic things that are already determined, i.e. the rotation of celestial bodies, okay? In contrast to eschatological revelation, which is grounded in an idea of free will, which means that everyone has free will, they make their own choices, and what happens to them is not dictated by the stars or God. It's dictated by your actions, okay? So again, this is in direct contrast to this idea of astrological divination. Now, just as a brief sidebar to kind of put some of this in context, we know that the zodiac is a very old symbol that's been around for a long time. You find it throughout history in multiple civilizations, as I've already mentioned. The term itself, zodiac, with the Latin root of zoo, is the same Latin root that we get for our term the zoo, where you go to see the animals, right? Or zoology, or zoological, okay? And the reason for that is it means animals. Okay, so the reason why this term is, or this thing, this wheel, this astrological wheel is referred to as a zodiac is because it's literally the wheel of animals. Okay, that's what zodiac actually means. It literally means the wheel of animals. Okay, now there's all different types of zodiacs. They don't necessarily match throughout history. every culture had their own, and the older forms of them tended to have maybe 10 different constellations that they tracked. But then as you move forward, it eventually becomes the 12 constellations that we find, which correlate with the 12 months of the year and the sort of yearly cycle of the Earth around the sun. Okay, and what used to happen is that there used to be priests or leaders, the sort of the wise men, the magi of their various communities, and they were tasked with studying the movement of the stars. So if you look at any of these ancient civilizations, you'll find that there's usually some type of temple, okay, that's centrally located, and that temple usually has what we would refer to as sort of an observational deck, okay? It's a place where these intellectuals of their era, these astrologers, could stand and position themselves in the temple and look directly outside of that and study the skies. And what they could find would be certain star patterns. And of course, they would jot these down and they would note it. And then what they would learn is slowly but surely, those move and a different set of star patterns appear. And then down the line, and eventually those old star patterns that they had seen before come back. Okay, and this is our cycle of the year. This was a profound discovery for ancient human civilizations, okay? It provided these men with essentially the ability to predict the future, okay? We now, as modern humans living in 2025, soon to be 2026, we take advantage of the fact that we understand days of the week, we understand calendars and years, and we organize our lives by that, but we don't really give it much thought. We just take it for granted. Oh, it's this month, it means this season, da-da-da. We know that, oh, winter's hitting, it's going to start getting cold again. You know, all the stores are going to start putting out the winter clothes. Or, oh, wait, it's going to be summer. All the stores are going to start putting out, you know, the swim trunks and tank tops and stuff like that, because it's seasonal, and we know those seasons are coming. But the ancient world, people didn't understand that at one point in time, right? These were nomadic cultures that were just traveling around and typically moving with animals, right? Wherever the animals went, they moved with them because that was how they survived. Once people were able to determine how the stars moved, they could then create calendars, and those calendars are essentially their zodiac wheel. And that allowed them to predict the seasons of the year. Okay, so they would know when it's going to rain, when it's going to snow, when there's going to be good weather, when you want to harvest, when the animals are going to be procreating, all these types of things. And what it allowed humans to do is move from being a nomadic culture to essentially being an agricultural culture. So it was a profoundly impactful discovery, okay, for humans. And we know that that's what they were doing for lots of reasons. If you've tracked some of the recent archaeological findings that they've had, one of the big ones is a place in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, and it's challenging a lot of the assumptions about standard archaeology, because this city seems to predate what we thought would be a normal time frame for human cities to exist. But what's also interesting is it's much lower, essentially, in the ground. It's deeper into the ground, which would make people think it's older, and yet it seems to be more advanced than what we would expect. But for the purpose of this conversation, what we've also learned is that there's this pattern we see other places, but Göbekli Tepe is a really good example of this, is that over time, the people living there would raise the temples to the ground, they destroy them, and they would rebuild it basically in the same spot. Why would they do that? Well, they're doing that because as time goes by, right, remember, they're observing the stars. As time goes by, slowly but surely, the rotation of the Earth is adjusting just a little bit. Just enough that over hundreds and even thousands of years, the observational area of the temple isn't matching perfectly with the alignment of the stars, okay? So what they have to do is they have to break the temple down, destroy it, and rebuild another one just slightly in a different direction to get them back on track, okay? Think of it like winding a watch, okay? Right? When you have a watch, you know that it's turning, and eventually over time, as the watch runs for a very long time, it starts to get a little bit off, and so you have to rewind it to get it back on track. Well, you couldn't wind a temple, so they would just sort of rebuild it. And it was always about keeping this sort of center line of where these constellations existed so that they could track these things. Now, one of the things that a lot of people, bring up about this is how the constellations oftentimes don't look anything like the sort of imagery that they assign to it, okay? Well, that's because we're looking at things from the back forward rather than from forward back, okay? We're looking at it from the wrong direction is what I mean. More often than not, the constellation that was being looked at per any season was only relevant insofar that it was identifying what season they were in, right? In the same way with a calendar. But as a heuristic device, right, as a learning aid or a tool for memory's sake, they would create images or symbols to assign to the constellations, right? And that would help them better remember those particular star patterns, okay? So what image they assigned to a particular star pattern was completely arbitrary. And in fact, it oftentimes didn't really relate to the star pattern. In some cases it did, right? If they could look at it, like, oh, it kind of looks, like a scorpion. Okay, well then they could do that. But other times it was maybe completely arbitrary, or it was related to this correlating season. Okay, so one good example of this we can look at is actually the month of May, and the symbol of the bull or ox, which is related to Taurus season. Okay, this is one of the most common symbols within all zodiacal traditions. Okay, and we know why this was the season of the bull, and it's not because the constellation looks like a bull, although astrologers have since gone in and tried to connect dots in different ways and highlight certain stars to kind of give us a bull image, again, as a heuristic device to help us remember those patterns. But the reason why it was the bull is because of when it occurred. So if I say April showers bring, any person who grew up in the United States knows the little aphorism is April showers bring May flowers. Okay, and it's a little statement about the coming of spring in the wake of winter. Okay, and that there's this rainy season that waters the earth, and from there crops emerge. Okay, well, that's April and May. And in ancient traditions, May was the season of tilling the ground, right? Because this is when you're going to start planting your crop. You plant it in the spring, May, and then you harvest it in the fall. Okay, this was the season of the ox, because in these ancient civilizations, that's the tool they used to till their ground. So whenever you start seeing the ox come out and everyone's out tilling their ground with their ox to get the fields ready, that's a season of the ox, which happens to be May, because April showers bring May flowers. This is just one example. And again, some of them were arbitrary, but some of them did make sense. I kind of use like the modern alphabet as an example. Like every language, every tradition, every people group has an alphabet. And they learn a song and they memorize the letters. But the actual letters themselves are arbitrary in terms of A is not literally the first letter of the alphabet. It doesn't matter which letter you put where, because words don't follow those patterns. You just want to learn the alphabet. So we put it in a little song that helps us to remember it, and then every kid knows it. And then when you say, what's the first letter of the alphabet? They say A. What's the second letter? B. Well, again, these are arbitrary placements of letters, but it's something that we as a society agree to adopt just for the point of clarity. Okay, so this is the type of thing I'm meaning with a lot of these zodiacal signs. It was sort of like arbitrary, and it related to just an agreed upon image to be associated with a constellation because it worked. It was practical. And that's why so many of these different zodiacal wheels have different zodiac signs, right? I mean, whether it's the Chinese version or the Mesoamerican version, it's not the same, although there are some overlapping things. Like, again, the bull is a very common one that we see. Hopefully that makes sense. But again, what this gets into is this sort of idea of astrological divination and the reoccurring pattern of the stars. But it has this overarching ideological understanding of fatalism, right? That if our fates are really controlled by the movement of stars, and that is on a set pattern, and that is very predictable, then our lives are on a set pattern, and they're also very predictable. And what place does free will have in that ideology? And this was a constant struggle for civilizations that predate Christianity in terms of trying to navigate that space between both fate and freedom, okay? And if you don't believe me, one, you can look at their texts, but I'll give you one literary example. I get to use my background in literature for this, and it's a helpful story to kind of put this in perspective. There's a famous play by the poet and playwright Sophocles. It's called Oedipus Rex. It ends up being the mythological story that Sigmund Freud uses when he creates his Oedipal complex in his psychological discourse. But for the sake of this, we're just talking about it as a play. And it's a story about fate, because you have this king and queen who have their first son who's born. He is Oedipus Rex. And they have a prophet, and this was a common thing, that a prophet would, anytime a future king was born, he would offer a prophecy about the child. I don't remember the play, because it's been a very long time, but I know that Tiresias was the common prophet in a lot of these plays, the blind prophet, okay? So it could have been Tiresias, I don't know. But he was a common prophet, there were others. Anyways, he prophesies that this child will grow up and kill his father, the king, and marry his own mother, the queen. So we have a story that's going to involve patricide, the murdering of your father, and incest, the marriage of your mother. Okay, well, obviously this is abhorrible to the people who hear this, the king and queen. So they try to take fate into their own hands. And what they do is Oedipus leaves the kingdom, and he grows up in a totally different environment, never knowing his mother and father. They're trying to do this because they think, well, we don't want that prophecy to come true. That's horrible. So they're going to try to, again, remove him from the scenario so that it never takes place, so that the prophecy doesn't come true. Well, of course, if you've read the story of Oedipus or you're familiar with it, you know that, of course, you can't beat the fates of the gods. What happens? Oedipus ends up one day growing up and being a great warrior and leader, as would be expected from his genealogical line. And he comes across another great warrior leader one day, and they end up getting in a disagreement, and they end up fighting, and Oedipus ends up slaying this man and killing him. And then he feels bad for this, so he goes to find where this man lives, and he meets this man's wife, and he finds out that this man was the king of his area. And then Oedipus falls in love with this woman and offers her his hand in marriage, and he marries her. And then, of course, the big surprise ending is he finds out that the man he slayed was his father, who he never knew. And the woman he married is his mother, who he also never knew. So this idea of freedom, he's seeking freedom to get away from the fates, right? But yet the fate still comes true, right? So it's this dual thing. It's a fail-fail. So if he had escaped the fates, well, then it would mean then the fates aren't real, right? The prophecy didn't come true. But if he does not escape the fate, and the prophecy does come true, and what the fates predicted happens, well, then it means he truly has no free will, right? So this is this conflict between fate and freedom. Another example we could give, not necessarily related to fate and freedom, but this idea of a perpetual cycle or perpetual wheel of time can also be found in Greek mythology. There's common tropes in any Greek story. One of them is the way in which a story begins. And I use scare quotes here because in Greek mythology, usually a story starts in what's called in medias res, which means in the middle of things, okay? Meaning that it's not a true beginning. The story just picks up in the middle of things. There's already stuff going on, and you're just sort of jumping in the middle, okay? And then the Greek stories usually end in another literary trope, which is known as deus ex machina, which means the gods have to intervene. And what happens is whatever the conflict in the story is, it gets so out of hand and such a mess on Earth that eventually the gods, whomever they may be that are servicing that territory, get involved and have to kind of fix things. But it's not a true solution. It's a sort of like it's sort of a quelling of the storm for the time being because things were getting out of hand. But there's no clear beginning, middle, and end, right? Again, which we find in an eschatological movement. And this gets back to this idea of astrological divination. This idea that it's a continual cycle. There's no real beginning, there's no real middle, there's no end, there's just now. And what happens now really is up to the fate of the gods. In medias res. When they get involved, they change things around, and what happens, happens. There's not really a key understanding of free will within this model. Okay, so let's keep that in mind because we're going to look at how this relates to also first century Judaism and how we put the context of the birth of Jesus into all of this knowledge. Okay, so I have a short little list here of things, so I try not to forget anything because it's a lot of information. So I'm just kind of crossing off as I go. As we move closer to the time when Jesus is born, there's a lot of confusion about this story, the birth of Jesus. And again, I highlighted it in this book because historically, scholars have not been able to agree on when this event took place. And a lot of it is based off the information they have, and then, of course, information they don't have, and the fact that these two things can't really be reconciled, okay? So a couple of these things that we can point out, we'll talk about right now. So if you know your Bible, you know that in the Gospels, there's 4 Gospels, 2 of them provide stories about the birth of Jesus. One of them takes place in Matthew, and the other takes place in Luke. Now, in the story that Matthew provides, it tells a story about how Herod is the king over Judea, ruling the Jews, and how he's visited by this group of magi, okay? And they come seeking the future king of Israel. And this gets Herod upset because he's the standing king and he has children of his own who will later become kings. And so they're trying to figure out where the child is because they're actually tracking a star. Okay, this is going to be really important. Now, what should also be pointed out, just for this part of the story, is that when the Magi, it seems from a careful reading, arrive at Harold's castle or wherever he's living, I don't know. It seems that the child has already been born, right? And they know that because of the star they're tracking. But they're waiting for the star to appear at a very specific time over the city of Bethlehem, per the prophecy. They do eventually find the child, as we learn in the story, and then they're warned not to return and tell Herod where he is, and then Mary and Joseph are warned that they're in danger, and at that point in time, they flee to Egypt, okay? This is the story in Matthew. Now, if you look at the story in Luke, it's a very different story, okay? It doesn't tell us anything about the coming of the Magi, okay? It doesn't really talk much about Herod either. Rather, it tells us a story about Quirinius, probably not say his name right, who was ruling over the territory at the time, and how there's this census that's being ordered. The technical term they use is registration. And as a result of this, people from all over Rome, the Roman Empire, have to go register, okay? And for this reason, Mary and Joseph have to travel to Bethlehem to register because they are from the line of David, okay? They get there, there's no room in the inn because Bethlehem's overflooded because of this event. They have to stay in the stable, and at that point in time, the child is born. The angel appears to the shepherds abiding by the flocks at night. They come and visit, and they see Jesus. So these are actually 2 different events, okay? One of them is taking place at the actual birth of Jesus of Nazareth, okay, which takes place in Bethlehem during this census. The second event is actually later, okay, and it takes place after Jesus has already been born, when the Magi go and seek to find where he is, okay? The problem is these 2 stories don't really match up well, and the details in these stories are also conflicting with what we know historically. So this has caused a lot of scholars to be skeptical about these accounts of Jesus' birth, okay? So one of the big things, probably the primary thing, is this story of Herod. We know that Herod was alive when Jesus was born. We don't know exactly when that was. However, we do have secondary sources, notably the Jewish historian Josephus, who documents in his writings that Herod died the year of an eclipse, okay? Well, again, we have another astrological sign, and that makes sense because in that world, that's how they documented things, right? Again, they don't have traditional calendars like we have, or watches or phones to keep track of this, but they could remember different celestial events, okay? So, of course, what scholars did is they went and looked for, well, when is there an eclipse that took place around this time? And sure enough, they find one in 4 AD, okay? Now, the problem with that is that pushes Herod's death back further than what the text suggests, okay? Most scholars, early scholars, claim that Jesus' birth took place sometime between 3 and 1 BCE. But that doesn't make sense because that means he'd be too old by the time Herod is dying. So essentially what they did is they just sort of moved the dates up. And I thought, well, he probably was born closer to 1 AD or something like that. And that would sort of fit the time frame. But there's other problems. It talks about Quirinius being the ruler, or the word is often translated as governor, and that he's overseeing this decree by Caesar Augustus for the census. Well, census were things that were regularly tracked by the Roman Empire to keep track of their citizens, but they didn't happen often. I think the rotation was like 20 to 25 years, I'm not sure. But either way, they were documented. And what scholars have pointed out is there's no actual documentation of a census happening under Quirinius or Herod around this time frame. But more importantly, they also know when Quirinius was the governor of the territory, and it wasn't while Herod was reigning as king. So again, it creates these problems. Like, how do you reconcile these two stories? They don't make sense. Furthermore, you get different genealogical accounts, right? In fact, in the book of Matthew, the first chapter provides a genealogy of Jesus, which you can read. But as you get to the bottom of the genealogy, it clearly states that this is the genealogy of Joseph, Jesus' father. Now we get a different genealogy later, and it doesn't match Matthew's genealogy. So people have proposed, well, perhaps one of the genealogies is Mary, and one of the genealogies is Joseph, and so you're getting two different genealogies. But the problem with that is, why do we need a genealogy of Joseph at all? If Jesus was the Son of God, he's born of God, he's not Joseph's son. So there'd be no reason to establish that Joseph, this is in verse 16 of chapter 1, has a genealogy that connects him to the house of David to fulfill the prophecy, because he's not Joseph's son, if that makes sense. So there's all these little types of problems. It turns out, actually, all of these things can be resolved. But, weirdly, it's not through the stories of Jesus' birth in Matthew, and it's not through the story of Jesus' birth in Luke. It's actually in the book of Revelation. Eschatological revelation. And that is where we're going to next. In order to understand the book of Revelation, you have to understand that in this world, the Roman Empire and the surrounding neighboring cultures, they had this understanding, this belief in astrological divination, right? These events that happened in the stars. And as you're moving through time and you get to the year of 2 BCE, actually specifically the month of August, the astrologers living at that time recognize that there's a very peculiar and strange event that's about to transpire. This is of significance, especially when you put it in the context of what we talked about a moment ago with this idea of fate versus free will. One of the ways that people living in this space, following this ideological system, try to argue that there was still room for freedom within astrological divination is that sometimes, although the stars tend to find a predictable pattern, sometimes there's changes. Sometimes there's weird things that happen. So whether it's an asteroid or a meteor that falls, a falling star, well, that's different. What is that? Okay. Or it could be something like an eclipse. Or it could be when two celestial bodies meet in the sky. That would be an omen in their minds. And in this particular case, in the coming of August of 2 BCE, there is a celestial event that could not be ignored. And that is where the planetary body of Jupiter, which they refer to as a star, even though we know it is a planet, actually comes into alignment with the planetary body of Venus. Okay, and they actually join together in the skies as essentially one giant star. Okay, well, the significance of this is not only just the celestial movement of these two bodies, but the very idea that these celestial bodies are also directly related to their pagan gods, right? The planet of Jupiter is called Jupiter because it was believed to be the thing that was their god, Jupiter. And Jupiter was their form of Zeus, i.e. the chief god, the king of all gods, the king of kings, of gods. Venus is a female deity, okay, who also is one of their chief patron gods. So the fact that these two planets are intermingling and meeting is highly symbolic. And it seems to predict the birth of something divine. In fact, in 40 BCE, the Roman poet Virgil, right, the author of the Aeneid, actually predicted that there is going to be the coming of a king. Okay, a new king who will change the order of the world, right? He will bring a new era of peace and prosperity throughout the Roman Empire. He predicted that in 40 BCE. Now, the Romans viewed that prophecy of Virgil to relate to Caesar Augustus. But the truth is, Caesar Augustus was already born. They interpreted, well, it must be a symbolic birth, because what happens is Caesar Augustus becomes the Caesar of Rome, and he brings Rome into this new era of power. Okay? So that's how they interpreted it. Well, when this event on August 2nd of 2 BCE, where Jupiter and Venus come in alignment, also happens to correlate with key events within the Roman Empire surrounding Caesar Augustus. Okay? Did I say Julius Caesar before? If I did, I meant Caesar Augustus. I'm sorry. I don't remember what I said. Sometimes I misspeak. I'm talking about Caesar Augustus. So if I said Julius Caesar, I'm wrong. Caesar Augustus. Just by way of example, I'm talking about Julius Caesar. There were different names for the months. So like the sixth month of the year was actually Sextilla, which is the sixth month. It gets named August after Caesar Augustus, which is one of the interesting things we're going to learn about, because this event happens in August, and it relates to Caesar Augustus. July, by the way, was named after Julius Caesar. So they essentially renamed these months based off the emperor in power, just as a caveat there, which you can file that away for whatever it's worth. Anyways, the year of 2 BCE is when the Roman Empire has been essentially formally in existence, according to their documented records, for 750 years. It's the 750th celebration of Rome. And on top of that, Caesar Augustus is moving into his 25th year as the emperor of Rome. It should be pointed out, while there had been many other Caesars that predate Caesar Augustus, he is the first emperor of the Roman Empire, because Rome actually becomes an empire. So prior to that, there were Caesars, which were their leaders, but when Rome becomes this global empire, they become emperors, and it's a higher order. So Caesar Augustus is the first emperor of Rome, first true emperor of Rome. Okay, well, they think, well, this has got to be the signs. Here we have the 750th year of the Roman Empire, and we have the 25th year reign of our great Caesar. We need to have a great celebration because of this phenomenal event. We've seen it in the stars where Jupiter and Venus align. And so what the Romans do is they get together and they decide to offer this sort of award. It's a title that they're going to give to Caesar Augustus. And the title is Pater Patriae. Okay? And what that means is the father of the fatherland. It's sort of like the highest title that a person can get. And this is something that's supposed to be celebrated throughout the entire Roman Empire. And what they do is they have a call that any Roman citizen must go do what? Register. They have to register, and they do so by declaring an oath that they will recognize Caesar Augustus as the Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland. Okay? Well, we know when this happens. Right? It happens in 2 BCE is when the event happens, and the actual registration process starts early the next year in February of 3 BCE. 2 BCE, I'm sorry. Did I get that wrong? Are my dates wrong? I'm gonna check. I'm gonna second guess myself here. Sorry. August of 3 BCE, I believe, is when I think I have my dates wrong. I had to go back here, guys. I'm sorry. I want to make sure I get this right. No. I am right? So yes, 3 BCE. So when is it? Yes, because it moves from 2 to 3, right? Let me go. Well, this is not a census, okay? It's not the census that we would typically think that would follow a 20 to 25-year pattern. It's not something that would be documented in a census record. It's a completely unique event that still requires a registration process. Okay, and it is well documented throughout all different types of Roman texts. Furthermore, what's interesting about it is the administrating figure over this process, right, of getting citizens to register for this declaring of an oath to Caesar Augustus is actually Quirinius. Quirinius was a long-term, regular political figure within the Roman Empire. He had been governor on two different, or he is, I should say, he was and is governor on two different occasions. So he's reelected. He served for a while, then wasn't, then reelected. But it just didn't make sense because it wasn't in alignment with when Herod was reigning. Well, now we can put this in context because actually, when the order for the Pater Patriae is taking place, Quirinius is not actually the governor of the territory, but he is the administrating body who's guiding this particular event, okay? This changes our timeline, but it's not just this. There's a lot more which we're going to get to, which is going to make all this make sense, okay? The problem is in the translation of the text, and it's not that it was translated wrong, it's translated correctly based on the information people had. And that is to say that the term that's used in relation to Quirinius is actually the term administrator. He's the administrating body over this under Caesar Augustus. Well, that term administrator can mean all different kinds of things in the same way that it can to us now. But historically and typically, the most common thing that meant is he was administering or ruling over a particular territory as a governor. So the common translation, well, he's the governor. Well, no, it's a mistranslation. The actual role is he's the administrating body. The same thing happens with the term registration. Registration is a term that can mean all different kinds of things, right? You can register for all different kinds of things. But classically, and in these contexts, the most common form of registration was a census. So it was an assumption. They assumed that the registration must be a census, and that he's the administrating body because he must be the governor. But again, that would be the normal conclusion. The problem is that in this particular instance, it's it's a one-off. It's something that's never happened before. This is a very special event. And that's why when Luke mentions it, he knows that everyone at that time knows exactly what he's talking about. And in fact, now we have some resources, they're later, but we find them in various Jewish and Roman writers, who they actually say that the event of Pater Patriae is the event Luke is talking about in his gospel. Well, now what this does is it explains so many things. For starters, it explains why we have no recorded census. Okay, it wasn't a census, it was an oath. It explains why Quirinius was the administrator. He wasn't the governor, he was just a ruling body over this unique event. Okay? It also doesn't conflict with Herod, but it also does something else. Throughout this entire time frame, because of these prophetic stories that are rising, again, I talked about in 40 BCE, Virgil was already prophesying these things. These types of prophecies were also prevalent throughout the Jewish communities as well. In fact, if you know your history about the intertestamental period, you know about the Maccabean revolt, where this individual, Judas Maccabeus, end up coming in and retaking the temple back because it was being used for pagan purposes, okay? And he was a military leader that was trying to restore the Jewish tradition and hand the Jewish temple back to the Jewish people. And many people viewed him as a messianic figure. However, he was never declared a true Messiah by the Jews because his story didn't fit the prophecy, okay? So the Romans were aware of this because they've had to deal with it on a military plane. They knew the Jews were expecting this Messiah, and they knew that it could have certain political and even military consequences. So, as a result of this, they did something that was really strange. They wanted to keep track of the Jews who actually were from the Davidic line, okay? Because they knew the prophecy. And the prophecy was that the coming Messiah will come from the line of David. So they're like, well, how many people do we still have that declare that we know are from the line of David? So when they're doing this registration, that's really about Caesar Augustus and recognizing him as the father of the fatherland, they're also like, well, let's try to use this time to get some of this organized. We're going to request that any Jew living in the Roman Empire who is actually born from the Davidic line has to go cast their vote, and register in the city of Bethlehem. Because they're trying to figure out who all these people are so they have a standing record of it. Well, as it turns out, both Mary and Joseph come from the line of David. So the reason that there's a genealogy of Joseph in the gospel is not because it's trying to establish that Joseph is Jesus' biological father. We already know that's not the case. In fact, Matthew tells us that he was virgin born of God. But rather is to explain why Joseph, like Mary, would also have to travel to Bethlehem. Both Mary and Joseph came from the line of David. And while Joseph isn't Jesus' biological father, he would still need to be in Bethlehem with Mary. That's why they're both there. Now that makes sense. But what about this timeline with Herod? There's still problems with this until someone realized, after doing a little bit of research, that actually, you know what, there were several eclipses that took place around this time, and one of them actually occurred in 1 BCE, a difference of 5 years earlier. And by simply acknowledging, well, this could be the actual eclipse that Josephus was referring to, rather than the eclipse in 4 BCE, now everything lines up. Because this gets back to the original portrayal of Jesus' birth taking place sometime between 3 and 1 BCE. And also, it relates to the events of the Pater Patriae, right, in this registration that's happening throughout Roman Empire. And it still lines up with Herod dying at the time of a eclipse. All of it's starting to make sense. The reason they were able to figure this out, though, is by looking at the symbols, the signs, and the dates given in the scriptures and backtracking them to get an actual framework. And for this, we need to start talking about the Chaldean Magi. If you know anything about the story of Jesus' birth, you know there's the story of the wise men. In tradition, we talk about it as 3 wise men, although it doesn't tell us their number, but we know they bring 3 gifts. So that's why they often say, well, there's 3 wise men, 1 wise man for each gift. Actually, what many people believe is that there were 12, which would fit the zodiacal calendar, which is what the Chaldeans were known for studying, okay? In this era of Rome, there are a group of people who are considered the experts around astrological divination, and they are known as the Chaldeans, okay? The Chaldeans is a group of people, they were known as magi, or wise men, who had been maintaining this order of study going all the way back to Babylon. Now, if you know your history, you know that Babylon had conquered much of the globe, and that included the nation of Israel, right? They went into Babylonian captivity, okay? The king that was in power was the man named by Nebuchadnezzar. We talked about him in one of my other videos and some of the prophecies that came about by way of dreams he had. When Nebuchadnezzar comes in power, he issues a decree where he wants all the best and brightest of young men to come to his temple, his kingdom, and so that he can build up this sort of, government, this, whatever you want to call it, this kingdom of all the best and brightest. One particular individual stands out, and he rises to becoming the head of the Magi, the head of the Chaldean order, okay? His Babylonian name was Belshazzar, but it turns out he was actually Jewish. He was one of the Jews who had been captured under Babylonian exile. We know that individual as Daniel. And if you know anything about Daniel, he prophesies himself. I believe it's in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel, that there will be a coming Messiah. So, while all of the Roman Empire is celebrating Caesar Augustus in the Pater Patriae of the father of the fatherland, and the signs in the sky, and they think it relates to him, the Magi, they have a different perspective. Because remember, their order stems back to the Jewish prophet Daniel. And it's for that reason that they're not looking for Caesar Augustus, they're looking for the King of the Jews. And they're following this star, which is actually the planet Jupiter, and they're watching it as it moves through the sky. And that's what brings them to Herod, and that's what eventually brings them to Bethlehem. These Gentiles, these non-Jewish people, these Magi, travel all the way from Babylon to Bethlehem, because they're trying to find the answer to the prophecy of Daniel. This will be important in a minute as well. File that in the back of your brain. We talked about the problem of Herod. We've established that rather than it being 4 AD, it seems to match now with 1 BCE, which allows us to put all these things in context. We've talked about the problem of Quirinius and how it wasn't because he was governor, but rather a sanctioning, administrating body over the Pater Patriae event around Caesar Augustus. Now it's time to look at something else. All of these are giving us clues, little clues about the birth of Jesus. And if you go into the Gospels, you'll know that before Jesus is born, something else happens, right? And that is the birth of his cousin, John the Baptist. Now, this can get into some really wonky details and all kinds of, tracking and data and looking at old calendars. Part of some of the problem with this, by the way, is that you have multiple nations interacting, and they all have their sort of own calendars. And sometimes even had multiple calendars. So if you think of how we have like maybe a calendar, like a business calendar of like when our physical year is, we have a seasonal calendar, probably have a school calendar if you have kids at home. All of these are different calendars. Okay, they have these types of things too. But on top of that, you had multiple civilizations and multiple people. So whether it was the Jews, whether it was the Babylonians, whether it was the Romans, whether it was the Greeks, whether it was the Persians, they all had their own sort of calendars. And so sometimes it's very difficult to get all these things lined up, okay? And so it takes some work, and it gets into real deep stuff that I'm not going to cover for now. But essentially, what we learn from the Bible in the passages about the birth of John is a few key things that are also going to put things in a timetable for us, okay, in a time frame. Okay, so let's go in here, and we're going to learn about John the Baptist. Oops, I went too far. I do that a lot. Bear with me. Okay, so there's the story of Joseph of Matthew. Now we're going to go to Luke, because that's where we get the story that I'm looking for about John the Baptist. Okay, so if you go to Luke chapter 1, verse 5, it tells us a few things. It gives us a time frame. Okay, it says this: in the days of Herod, so again, we get that time frame, but now we know it's an earlier date than we thought. The king of Judea, that's who he was, there was a priest named Zachariah of the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughter of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth, and they were both righteous before God, etc., but they had no child, Now, while he was serving as priest before God with his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense, okay? This is a very specific time frame, because what happened in Judaism is there was this sort of Levitical line of priests, which Zechariah is one of, and there's too many of them. In fact, it got up to the number where they had 24 regularly sanctioned Levitical priests. Okay, in fact, many people think that number 24 may be why we have the 24 elders in the vision of John of Patmos in the book of Revelation. Okay, we don't know. Nevertheless, one of the things that David does when he's king, which you can read about in 1 Chronicles, is he decides to bring some structure to all this. And what he realizes is there's essentially 3 weeks out of the year where they kind of need all hands on deck. So any of the, sort of priests of the Levitical line who are part of that 24 group, they have to come to the temple and they have to lead and help to handle all of this influx of people for these specific seasons. But in their calendar, because they follow a lunar calendar versus a solar calendar, they only have 51 weeks per year. So 3 of those weeks get tied up in these big, ceremonial religious festivals. The other 48 weeks of the year are split, so that as a priest, you have a cycle, one service you have to do as the priest in the temple the first half of the year, and then you have to do it again in the second half of the year. Okay, and those are your 2 cycles, and that's why you split. And this is telling us when this is taking place. So it's giving us Zechariah, who's of this order, the Abijah, as this particular line of his priestly responsibilities. And that's giving a timetable, and it gets real complicated. But I'm not going to get into all that because I've already gone on for a long time. But essentially, after all the things are plugged in and people find this out, there's a couple things that people sort of have agreed upon. And that is that John the Baptist was born approximately 6 months before Jesus of Nazareth. And what they find is that it seems, based off of when his father receives the prophecy from God that his wife is going to bear a child, and the fact that we know that when Mary visits Elizabeth, Elizabeth's already pregnant, and her child, John, is kicking her in the womb, right? When she sees Mary and knows that Mary's pregnant. So it seems she's probably like in her sort of final trimester. She's moving in this. And all this makes it to this idea that John was probably born about 6 months before Jesus, okay? And they can actually place it based on this information and other information. And the idea is that he was probably born in March, okay, of that year. That's going to be interesting as well. So file that back. Many scholars have highlighted several strange things in the Bible about the birth dates of Jesus. Most agree that it probably was not December 25th. It doesn't seem to match the text. For starters, if John was born in March and Jesus is 6 months later, that puts him in the fall, not the winter. But there's other little clues. None of them are definitive, but one of the things we learn is that on the night Jesus is born, the shepherds are out in the fields watching their sheep. And this is not something that would normally transpire in the dead of winter. It'd be too cold. It would usually be happening in like late spring or early fall. Another idea. But there's even a more significant one, okay? And this has to do with the book of Revelation. I did a whole video on the book of Revelation. I talked about how it exists on multiple levels. I talked about how it is a allegory for first century Rome, which is true. I talked about how it was discussing past events, current events, but also looking to the future. But there's also this huge element about the book of Revelation that has directly to do with the astrological divination and the idea that was prevalent throughout pagan Roman culture. Versus, as we talked at the beginning, eschatological revelation, which is what's happening here with John of Patmos. And it all goes back to this passage that we looked at previously, which is chapter 12 of Revelation, the portent or the sign. And if you read this carefully again, and you hear what it has to say, it says some things that are quite significant. It says this, chapter 12, verse 1. The great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out, in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in the heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and the heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of the heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to the male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness, where she was placed by God. We know this is an allusion to Mary and Jesus. Many people believe, like myself, that this is also an allusion to Herod and the Roman Empire, trying to kill the child of Christ. But what a lot of people don't know is that John is intentionally using the imagery of a first century Roman by applying astrological signs to the event of Jesus' birth. And as it turns out, these are actual historical events. And scholars have been able to put this on a timetable and backtrack it, and they find that the event of Jupiter and Venus coming together is not the only bizarre astronomical event that takes place around this time. There's something else. On a specific day of the year, a specific time, the constellation known as Virgo, September, which is represented by a virgin, comes into alignment with the sun. And the sun crosses the constellation body at the center of her body, lighting her up, lighting her clothes with the light of the sun. And there's also a moment in this where the moon moves and sets directly below the feet of the Virgo constellation. John of Patmos is actually telling them the exact moment when Christ was born. And he's using the stars to tell us when it happened. And do you know what date it is? The date is September 11th of 3 BCE. Now, just as a point of clarification, Caesar Augustus is going to be named the father of the fatherland, but that public ceremony won't take place until August of 2 BCE. That could be confusing, but what you have to understand is that the actual registration process, where all the citizens of Rome have to cast their ballots for this honorary award, takes place the year prior, which would be 3 BCE, and in alignment with this, the birth of Christ. Now, why is this important? Well, for starters, it maps all the other points we've made. It lines up with the registration being ordered in Rome. It lines up with the birth of John. It lines up with where we would actually place now Herod, based off the new information about the eclipse. But there's more than that. Again, travel back in time and you find what happened at that point in time. It's what in Jewish tradition is known as Tishri 1. I hope I said that right. Or the start of Rosh Hashanah. This cannot be overlooked. And any Jew would know what this meant. Because Rosh Hashanah in the Jewish tradition is the start of their new year. And it's a symbolic celebration of the covenant that they make with God. And it's also directly linked within the tradition to the creation of Adam and the birth of Noah, and subsequently the re-establishing of the new covenant after the flood. This is the day that Jesus is born. This is the day the Messiah comes. On the day of Tishri 1, the start of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, the time of the new covenant, that he, as the new Adam, is being brought to humanity. At the same time, according to their tradition, the original Adam was first formed from clay and spirit. It gets better. So hold on to your hats. If you step back and look at the Jewish calendar again, and you place it in context of not just when Jesus of Nazareth is born, in Bethlehem, fulfilling the prophecy of the virgin, not only literally because Mary is a virgin, but astrologically because he's coming from the constellation of the Virgo, right? That's when the stars are aligning with his birth. When you look at when John the Baptist, his cousin, is born in March, what season is that? It's the season of the Passover. Why is that significant? We'll probably get lost on most contemporary Protestants. If you know anything about the Jewish Passover, you know that one of their long-standing traditions is that they leave a chair open at the table and a glass of wine. And when asked, well, who's that seat for? They say, who? That's for Elijah. Because the prophet will return and he will announce the coming of the Messiah. And who is John the Baptist? Well, we learn, if you remember from my previous episode, when Jesus transfigures, right, at the base of Mount Hermon and reveals his true self to his apostles. They ask, you are the Messiah, but what about the coming of Elijah? And he said, he already came. He came before me, and you guys missed it. You didn't catch it. And they say in the scriptures, and they knew he was talking about who? John the Baptist. John the Baptist is born during the season of Passover, when they eagerly await the arrival of Elijah. Now let's backtrack to the book of Matthew, because we still have these Chaldean magi searching for the person of Jesus. But it takes them time. And in fact, what we find is that by the time they actually track down the child, he's older. In fact, the term they use is child. They don't use a baby anymore. And in some translations, they say he's by his mother, and someone actually says he's standing by his mother. So it seems that he's what we would now refer to as a toddler, right? He's grown. Why he's back in Bethlehem, it never tells us, okay? We know that Mary and Joseph do leave Bethlehem. They go back to Galilee or Nazareth. But for some reason in this story, she's back in Bethlehem. Again, no explanation, when they find her. But it's much later, because the child is not a baby, it's a child. And they're able to link this also astrologically, because they're following the star of Jupiter. Though Jupiter, the star or planet that represents the King of Kings. And they've been tracking it since the emergence of it uniting with Venus, right, in this symbolic act. But now they're following it, and they're waiting for it to stand still above the city of Bethlehem, because that is the prophecy. And that happens on a very specific day, which is the day of winter solstice, which is December 25th, which is also known as the season of light, the season of Hanukkah. Why are the Magi carrying gifts? Because they know Jewish tradition. And they know that in the season of Hanukkah, you bring gifts. And this is why they're offering it to him. John the Baptist is born during Passover as the new Elijah. Jesus of Nazareth is born at the alignment of the stars when the Virgin is in alignment with the city of Bethlehem per the prophecy, and then he's found again during the winter solstice of December 25th by the Magi during the season of Hanukkah. All of this is symbolic. All of this would have been understood by a first century Jew. But perhaps what's most important about all of this is not what it taught the Jews, but what it taught the Gentiles. Remember, the Chaldeans aren't Jews, but they are the most knowledgeable wise men around the movement of stars and solar and celestial bodies. Virgil had predicted that there would be a coming of a child. He would be born. The tradition of astrological divination recognized that these astrological events had great power and meaning. They thought it must be related to Caesar Augustus. That's why they put out this oath to celebrate him as the father of the fatherland. But there's something that's even more interesting about all of this. If you look at the zodiac, okay, there's a Chaldean zodiac, which actually then is adopted by Rome. Rome actually, the Romans eventually make a shift or a change on the zodiac. They change it. They actually add Libra, the Libra constellation, and they make it the measuring scales of Rome, like the scales of justice, okay? But that wasn't in the Chaldean zodiac. In the Chaldean zodiac, the Libra sign is actually the extension or the clause of the Scorpio sign, which comes right before it. Scorpio is a symbol that has been and still is, depending on the zodiac calendar you use, that's directly symbolic of what? The dragon. So when you put this in context and you chart this, you have first the season of Leo, or the lion, which is symbolic of the King of Kings. right? This was a symbol that was also known in Rome, but it was a symbol that was also used by the Jews, because the Messiah is said to be what? The King of Judah. And after the planet of Jupiter aligns with Venus, it moves out of the constellation of Leo, and it moves into the constellation of Virgo, who is symbolic of what? The Virgin, right? The Virgin Maiden, with whom the Messiah will come. And after the birth of Christ, when the Virgo moves through the celestial skies, follows a zodiac pattern, what's coming from behind? The dragon. And the constellation of Libra combined with this constellation of Scorpio is actually a very large constellation. In fact, it takes up about 1/3 of the stars in the sky, just like the book of Revelation. What is the meaning of this? Is it an affirmation of astrological divination? No. Quite the contrary. This is a cosmological statement of eschatological revelation. Jesus is not just the Messiah of the Jews. He is the King of Kings. He is the Messiah to all nations. He's even using their narrative. He's using their ideology, astrological divination, to reveal who he is. You know what else is interesting? If you look at any ancient religious tradition, there, besides these stories about giants and the children of gods and these types of things, there's another, there's several, but there's another one that's real interesting. There's a real common story. And it's in Egyptian, it's in Mesopotamian, you can find it in Greek, Roman, across the globe, Mesoamerican, Asian, Chinese calendars. It's this story of the battle with the dragon. Usually it involves some type of deity, a god, like Jupiter. It involves some type of maiden, female. Again, we could look at Isis or Ishtar. And then this battle of a dragon. And usually there's a child, a son, Horus, whomever, Apollo in some cases, who has to fight the serpent and defeat it. Remember that in these traditions, they would link the mythological stories of their gods to what? The stars. And that these stories moved with the stars. What does this mean? Well, perhaps we should look to what St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, had to say when he himself travels to Rome. It's interesting when you read the Bible, because what you'll see as you're reading these books like Acts and the book of Romans and some of these other letters from Paul is that there's a lot of Gentiles who've adopted this idea of Jesus as Messiah. Why are the Gentiles so quick to do this? Why are they so quick to abandon their tradition? The tradition of Caesar Augustus, the father of the fatherland, in place of Jesus of Nazareth. Because they too understood the meaning of this event. Chapter 9, verses 27 and 28 and 29. Actually, that's not the passage I wanted to read. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Sorry. I'm actually in chapter 9, verses 29. So this video's going along. I apologize. Maybe I'll edit that out. So let's look here at Romans chapter 10, which is where I meant to be. I thought I was. And look down here. That's also an Isaiah reference. So that's, I think, partially why I got confused. Apologize. Chapter 10, verses 14. How then will they call on him in who they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? He's saying, like, how are they supposed to know? What are all these people who haven't heard, who haven't been told, who haven't been, heard the missionary voice of Paul? It says, and how are they to preach unless they are sent? It says, and as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news, but they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have. For the voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. This is just one passage like this. There's several that allude to this. But what Paul is alluding to is there's like, well, what about those who haven't heard? And he's saying essentially, for the sake of this video, to bring clarity, they have heard. Because the message was written in the skies. It's in the fabric of the cosmos. And it's not there because it's a fated event. It's not astrological divination. It's there because it's eschatological revelation. It's a movement towards something. And all of these things, including the Jewish prophecies, but not just those, even the prophecies of the pagan traditions, even their mythologies, are all being fulfilled in this event. That is actually the revelation of John. That's the unveiling. That's the lifting of the curtain. Here it is. And he uses allegory. He uses historical context. He uses the prophecies of the Jewish tradition. But he also uses the prophecies, the ideology of the pagans. That is the meaning of Christmas. In case you didn't know. Merry Christmas.